The hallway outside room 412 had grown painfully quiet. Nurses moved gently past the door, their eyes soft with sympathy. Inside, a little girl named Sophie lay curled under a blanket dotted with cartoon stars, her chestnut hair fanned out like sunlight on the pillow. At just 6 years old, Sophie had faced more than most do in a lifetime. Diagnosed with a rare and aggressive brain tumor that resisted every form of treatment, doctors had tried everything: chemotherapy, clinical trials, even a last hope surgery. But the tumor was unrelenting. Now, there were only days left, maybe less. The hospital's pediatric palliative care team at Evergreen Children's Hospital focused on keeping her comfortable. Her parents, Anna and Michael, clung to her small hands like they could hold back time itself. But even through the grief, there was one presence that offered a strange sense of calm. Shadow. Shadow was Sophie's German shepherd. Not just a pet, but her guardian, her best friend, her constant shadow. He had been with her since the day she was born, a birthday gift from her grandfather, who passed away when Sophie was 3. Since then, Sophie and Shadow had grown up side by side. Wherever she went, Shadow was there. He'd even sit beside her stroller as a pup, refusing to move unless she was in his sight. When Sophie fell ill, Shadow knew, long before the scans and hospital visits began. His behavior changed. He would curl up beside her longer, lick her forehead every morning as if checking on her, and whimper whenever she seemed tired. And when hospital stays became longer than time at home, the staff made an exception. Shadow could stay. He was given a special hospital vest and ID tag. Nurses brought him food and water. And every morning, Shadow would climb onto Sophie's bed, lay his head across her chest, and close his eyes. Somehow, his breathing matched hers, deep, slow, protective. One night, the doctor gathered Anna and Michael in the hallway and said what they feared most. There's not much time. Maybe 2, 3 days. Prepare yourselves. Anna collapsed into Michael's arms. Back in the room, Sophie looked peaceful. She wasn't scared. Perhaps she didn't fully understand. Or maybe it was because Shadow made her feel safe. She whispered to him often, little secrets, wishes, stories only he knew. That night, as the hospital dimmed and rain tapped softly against the windows, Sophie opened her eyes and reached for Shadow. Her hand shook, but her voice was clear. Shadow, if I can't wake up, find it for me, please. Shadow lifted his head and stared into her eyes, ears twitching. She leaned closer and whispered something no one else heard. After a pause, Shadow let out a low, deep bark, just once, and laid back down beside her. Anna, watching quietly from the recliner, didn't think much of it. She didn't yet know that Shadow understood far more than anyone had realized. The next morning, Shadow was gone. Anna screamed. Nurses searched every floor. Security checked the cameras. Somehow, in the middle of the night, Shadow had slipped out through a partially open maintenance door on the ground floor. Sophie, too weak to speak, simply blinked slowly and pointed toward the window. He'll come back, she whispered hoarsely. He knows what he's looking for. No one understood what she meant. The doctors didn't press her, but something had shifted in the room. Sophie, though fading, looked oddly at peace. She smiled and drifted off to sleep again, as if she knew the story wasn't over. And that Shadow, wherever he was, had a mission. The streets outside Evergreen Children's Hospital were slick from the early morning rain. Cars splashed by without noticing the sable blur moving with fierce determination through alleys and sidewalks. Shadow, Sophie's loyal German shepherd, ran like he had a destination burned into his memory. No leash, no human, just one purpose. He didn't stop for noise or traffic. He crossed streets carefully, as if remembering his training, darting only when the coast was clear. Passers-by might have seen him and thought he was lost. But Shadow wasn't wandering. He was searching. 3 miles away, in a quiet suburb, Shadow arrived at a familiar front yard. It was Sophie's old home. Her toys were still scattered on the porch. A red plastic ball, a faded jump rope, a sun-worn stuffed bunny. Shadow sniffed around, pausing at the garden that Anna once tended. Then, without hesitation, he headed straight to the backyard, behind the tool shed. There, beneath a patch of disturbed dirt, Shadow began to dig. Anna had long forgotten the tiny pouch they had buried there 2 years ago. It was a small, hand-stitched velvet bag filled with things Sophie once called her treasures. A string bracelet she'd made in preschool, a pebble shaped like a heart, a crayon drawing of her and Shadow beneath a rainbow, and most importantly, a note to her grandfather, the one who had given her Shadow. Shadow clawed at the soil until the pouch was free. Then, muddy and panting, he gently took it in his mouth and ran back the way he came. Back at the hospital, Sophie's condition had worsened. Her heartbeat was weak. Monitors beeped in stuttered rhythm. Nurses kept vigil while Anna and Michael sat beside her, tear-streaked and silent. Time was running out. Then, at exactly 7:14 p.m., the automatic doors of the children's wing whooshed open. A gasp echoed down the hallway. "Shadow," one nurse exclaimed. There he stood, soaked from the rain, his fur caked in mud, and in his mouth, the little velvet pouch. "How did he?" a nurse began. But Shadow didn't pause. He trotted straight to room 412. Inside room 412, Sophie was barely conscious. Her breaths were shallow. Anna sat beside her, gently humming the lullaby she used to sing when Sophie was a baby. Michael looked up when Shadow appeared at the door, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Shadow," he breathed. Shadow moved toward the bed and gently placed the pouch beside Sophie's hand. The moment her fingers touched it, her eyes fluttered open, and for a brief second, color returned to her face. Her lips curled into a faint smile. "He found it," she whispered. Anna leaned closer. "What is it, baby?" Sophie's voice was faint, almost like wind. "My promise, for Grandpa." Shadow remembered. Anna opened the pouch, and gasped. Tears poured down her face as she pulled out each item. The bracelet, the heart-shaped pebble, and the drawing, a crayon sketch of Sophie and Shadow under a rainbow. Across the top, in Sophie's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "If I ever get sick, I'll find my way back with Shadow. Just like Grandpa said, we'll follow the rainbow." The room filled with silence. Not sorrowful silence. Reverent stillness. Even the monitors seemed to pause for a beat. Dr. Ingwin, the pediatric neurologist, stepped in just in time to witness it. She watched as Sophie clutched the drawing to her chest and whispered something to Shadow. Then, Sophie fell asleep. But something had changed. An hour passed. Then two. Sophie's breathing steadied. Her oxygen levels, once dangerously low, began to normalize. "She's stabilizing," one nurse whispered. Dr. Ingwin stared at the screen in disbelief. "That's medically impossible." She wasn't the only one crying. A nurse wiped her eyes. Michael stood frozen. And Anna, she held Sophie's hand in Shadow's paw at the same time, whispering, thank you, boy." Shadow lay down, curling up beside Sophie, placing his head right back where it always belonged, across her heart. No one could explain it. No medication had been administered. No procedure had taken place. But something invisible had shifted the course. Later, Dr. Ingwin reviewed Sophie's charts over and over again. "It's like her body responded to something unseen," she whispered. "Something emotional, maybe even spiritual." The head nurse spoke quietly. "Or something loyal." Because while medicine had reached its limit, Shadow hadn't. He had listened. He had remembered. He had acted, not out of command, but out of love. And somewhere deep in the folds of Sophie's dreams, a rainbow was forming. 2 days had passed since Shadow returned with the velvet pouch. 2 days since the doctors prepared for the worst. And yet, Sophie, the little girl who was supposed to be in her final hours, was still breathing. More than that, she was improving. Her vitals, once erratic and fading, had stabilized. Her fever had broken. She opened her eyes and stayed awake for longer than a few seconds. Nurses watched in awe as she reached for water, whispered Anna's name, and even laughed. A faint giggle, but unmistakable. The hospital staff began whispering in the halls. Some called it a turnaround. Others, a fluke. But all of them agreed on one thing. Shadow had something to do with it. Dr. Gwynn, the head of pediatric care, ordered new scans. She expected to see the same grim results. The tumor still pressing mercilessly against Sophie's brain. But when she reviewed the images, she sat back in her chair, stunned. The tumor had shrunk. Not completely, but noticeably, significantly. The kind of progress that normally took weeks of aggressive treatment. But Sophie hadn't had any treatment in over a month. There was no medical explanation. Dr. Gwyn entered room 412, holding the new scans. Anna and Michael rose instantly, fear still in their eyes. But Dr. Gwyn's expression was different. Her lips trembled. "There's been regression," she said. Michael blinked. "Regression?" She nodded. "The tumor, it's shrinking." Anna gasped. "You mean, she's—" "I don't know what this means long term," the doctor admitted. "But for now, your daughter is still fighting." Sophie was now sitting up in bed, with Shadow curled beside her. She looked from the adults to Shadow and said softly, "I told him to find it. I told him Grandpa would know." Michael stepped closer. "Baby, what did you mean?" Sophie reached into the velvet pouch and pulled out the crayon drawing again. Her fingers traced the rainbow. "When Grandpa died, he told me he'd send signs if I ever got lost or scared. He said Shadow would be the bridge. That's why I made the drawing, so Shadow could find the way back." Anna knelt beside her. "You believe Shadow saved you?" Sophie's smile widened. Her eyes sparkled with something ancient and true. "I don't just believe it. I know it." Word spread quickly. Doctors from other wings visited to review the case. Nurses brought small gifts. Other children asked to meet the dog with magic in his fur. A week later, a second scan confirmed continued tumor regression. The doctors no longer whispered about miracles. They said the word out loud. "Something happened here," Dr. Ingwin said in a staff meeting. "Something beyond medicine. We talk about science. But this was love." On Sophie's 8th day of recovery, the hospital held a small celebration in the children's ward. Balloons lined the halls. Sophie wore a tiny pink crown and a hospital gown covered in colorful marker doodles from the other kids. Shadow stood proudly at her side, a gold medal hanging from his collar. It read, "Bravery without words." Even Dr. Gwyn had tears in her eyes. Sophie asked to say something. The room quieted as she took the microphone. "I was really sick," she said, voice soft but steady. But Shadow didn't give up. He remembered the promise I made to Grandpa. And when he brought me that pouch, it felt like I was being held. Not just by him, but by love. Real love. She looked down at Shadow, then whispered, "You're my miracle." The following month, Sophie was discharged. Not as a child in her final hours, but as a girl in remission. Doctors continued tests, of course, monitored her closely. But with each passing day, the results showed only more hope. And Shadow stayed by her side through it all, just like he always had. Years later, Sophie's speech. When Sophie was 13, healthy and vibrant, she stood at a medical conference hosted by Dr. Gwyn. Shadow, older and a bit grayer, lay quietly at her feet. She looked out over the crowd of doctors and scientists. "They said I had days left," she said. But Shadow didn't believe that. He believed in me. And I think sometimes, when the world gives up, it's the ones who love us most, who hold us high. The entire room rose to their feet. Because sometimes, a dog's heart knows the way back, when no one else can. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who believes in the power of love, loyalty, and second chances. Have you ever experienced a moment where an animal just knew what you needed? Tell us your story in the comments. We read everyone. Like this video if Shadow stole your heart. Subscribe for more true stories that prove love can do the impossible. And don't forget to hit the bell, because the next miracle might be one click away.